Welcome to Wishpath Yoga. My name is Meredith. I've been invited by a friend to give a talk tomorrow at the local Unitarian Service. So she wanted me to come and share my experience of yoga, meditation, Buddhist philosophy, how it's been helpful in my life, and also try to relate it to the Seven Principles of Unitarianism. So I thought I would record my talk, have a little practice running through my notes, and share it with you. So I hope it's beneficial. Okay. So we're all motivated by two main wishes: the wish to find happiness and the wish to avoid suffering. So in this way, at heart level, we're all the same. So our wishes for happiness have equal value. So no one's happiness is more or less important than anyone else's. Buddha said, to know happiness, we must first acknowledge suffering and understand its causes. In his teachings on the Four Noble Truths, he described how we can achieve cessation of suffering by following a spiritual path. So often we avoid looking at our suffering because we don't know what to do with it when we encounter it, and because we believe it is who we really are. So as a result, we tend to, when we notice something yucky, we tend to react with aversion and panic when we identify really strongly with our sufferings. And then we usually reach for things outside of ourselves to try and find relief. So a fundamental and helpful teaching in Buddhism is that suffering is a common experience that we all share, but that one's essential nature is not suffering. In Buddhism, one's essential nature is described as a peace that is rooted in wisdom. So this view enables us to learn to relate to our suffering really differently. So we're all looking for positive experiences and attempting to avoid negative ones. And so we end up qualifying the experiences we have as positive, negative, or neutral. And when we're talking about them or we're thinking about them, our language will describe external events. But when we're making these qualifications of positive, negative, or neutral, what we're actually describing are the feelings that we're having in that moment. And because our feelings are internal, the causes for our feelings have to come from the inside too. And what Buddha teaches is that these feelings are dependent on the stories with which we're identifying in any moment in time. So our experiences are actually going on inside of us, not on the outside. So Buddhism is an introspective study of happiness and suffering and presents a psychology of the mind and an understanding of the mind as the creator of our happiness and suffering. So in this psychology, we come to understand which states of mind generate happiness and which states of mind generate suffering. So the main practice of Buddhism is that of refuge. So going for refuge is the way in which we go about transforming our minds. And we're making these transformations so that our minds can start to generate the happiness that we seek. So a Buddhist practitioner wishing to develop the states of mind that generate happiness will go for refuge to Buddha's teachings on the mind by studying and meditating upon them. By relying on the Sangha, or spiritual community, support, one puts the teachings into practice to transform the mind. So in so doing, one becomes able to alleviate one's own suffering, increase one's own happiness, and thereby we become sort of in a position that we can help other people do the same. So from the view of the mind being the creator of happiness and suffering, we learn to study our mental habits and actions. In order to put spiritual teachings into practice, we can learn how to become more objective in relation to our feelings and thoughts. We can observe which mental habits bring happiness and which ones bring suffering within ourselves based on personal experiences. So we can draw conclusions and generate intentions reflecting the changes and the healing that we seek. Then the Dharma teachings become part of one's own knowing, because it is proven through personal experience. So the main tool for doing this is meditation. Suffering itself and our shared desire to alleviate it is the reason that we do this introspective look. Therefore, in the presence of compassion and skillful means, suffering itself becomes the alchemical ingredient needed for healing and conscious evolution. So here's the key though. We must study suffering from the perspective that it is not who we are fundamentally. It is also helpful to conduct the study from an understanding that we are in a constant state of transformation. Thoughts, sensations, feelings rise, crest, and dissolve back in the mind, into the mind, the same way that waves do this on the surface of the ocean. So things are always changing, so we're never stuck. If we believe we are inherently stuck and in the nature of suffering, healing is impossible. Suffering is rooted in a mistaken understanding of how we actually exist. When we understand this fundamental mistake, we can understand how healing and spiritual growth and transformation is actually possible. Buddha teaches that the nature of consciousness is inherently peaceful when it is unobstructed by ignorance and mistaken views. This is described as one's Buddha nature. So in preparation for this talk, because I haven't sort of had the exposure to Unitarianism the same way I have with Buddhism, I did a little bit of studying and spoke with a friend who's a member of this congregation. And I read about the 7 principles of the Unitarian Church. And the first one really stood out to me. It describes the inherent worth and dignity of each being. So what I did then was I looked up the sort of Latin origins and meanings of the words worth and dignity. And this is what the descriptions I found. Noble, of high rank, to come to be, to turn into, and merit. So this is really cool because the word merit shows up a lot in Buddhist teachings. Buddha teaches that happiness is directly proportional to the amount of wisdom and virtue in one's mind. Virtue, or positivity, increases merit, or positive energy, and therefore happiness. Worth suggests a being of high rank coming to be and to turn into. In Buddhism, enlightened beings are described as those whose minds are filled with truth and virtue. They are considered holy and of high rank and described as the awakened ones. By practicing spiritual paths, they transformed their minds. The nature of their awakened or enlightened minds enables them to help others also find healing. The word dignity suggests merit or worth. And I found this interesting. Generating happy minds familiar with truth and virtue requires positive energy. And in Buddhism, this energy is described as merit. Dignity suggests, these words dignity and worth, that are the sort of first principle in Unitarianism, ties in really beautifully with the practice of Buddhism of transforming consciousness. So this first Unitarian principle describes the potential of every human being to awaken and to heal through introspective spiritual study. So in searching for spiritual truths on the nature of happiness and suffering, we can learn to manifest our own highest potential. We can experience the transformation offered by spiritual practice. So we live in a really crazy world which is constantly seducing us that happiness can be found and the alleviation of suffering can be found outside of ourselves. So this is where having spiritual community is really important, and this is another sort of tenet of the Unitarian principles, because our spiritual friends will support our search for truth and meaning as we do this kind of 180 turn toward looking within to find these solutions. So when we get still and we turn our minds inwardly, we connect with our human experience. some days this is easier than others. But we can learn to connect to our suffering compassionately and objectively, and from the perspective of our inherent worth and dignity. In so doing, we can manifest our inherent capacity to become increasingly conscious and enlightened beings. By following a spiritual path, we can turn into a being whose mind is free from the inner causes of suffering and whose mind is pervaded with the wisdom that brings ultimate inner peace. So we can go into and hold our pain with compassion and apply spiritual tools to self-soothe. This alchemy leads to change. The understandings we attain increase our wisdom of and compassion for ourselves and others. Because we are all interdependent, as we heal, we become a source of healing for others. Because all actions of body and speech begin in the mind, as we become more peaceful inwardly, our behaviors and actions in the world will be more peaceful, and thereby help to increase peace in the world. So, those are just ideas that floating a lot in my mind right now, just sort of changing this relationship to pain and suffering. And if we understand that we're always changing and that our essential nature is actually really peaceful, we can learn to sort of relate to pain as like a messenger that's sort of calling for our compassion and attention. So in the same way as when we get close to like a really hot stove and we start to perceive that sensation of pain, heat, it gets our attention. So pain is our body's way of getting our attention that something's wrong. That's really the only purpose. And I sort of believe that we can relate to sort of emotional pain in the same way. So it's calling for our attention so that we can soothe it and return to our more natural state. So we often find this easier to do in the context of knowing the tools and having the support of people who understand from their own personal experience how to do this, and they can't do it for us, but they can support the efforts that we take. So anyway, I hope this is beneficial, and I wish you lots of love and compassion and deep healing. Okay, have a good night. Namaste.